Alisa sat by the large bay window, sipping her evening tea as the golden sunlight streamed into the room. Her life had settled into a comfortable routine: morning yoga, afternoon charity work, and evenings spent hosting guests or reading in solitude. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Her husband, Richard, was a successful businessman who provided her with a life of luxury and stability. They shared a respectful, if not particularly passionate, marriage. Daniel had always been a distant figure in their household. He was Richard's son from his first marriage, a young man in his mid-20s with a sharp mind and an independent streak. Though Alisa had been a part of his life for nearly a decade, their relationship remained formal, limited to polite greetings and small talk at family gatherings. She had never pushed for more. After all, he had grown up without her, and she understood that trust took time. That evening, Richard was away on a business trip, leaving the house unusually quiet. Alisa had finished dinner early when she heard footsteps approaching the living room. Daniel entered, carrying a book in his hand. "I didn't know you liked philosophy," he remarked, glancing at the title on the table. She smiled. "It helps me understand people better." Daniel smirked and sat across from her. "And have you figured people out?" "Not entirely," she admitted. "They're more complicated than books." For the first time in years, their conversation flowed effortlessly. What started as a casual discussion about literature turned into something deeper. They talked about ambitions, regrets, and the choices that defined their lives. Alisa was surprised by Daniel's depth. He was no longer the reserved teenager she had met years ago, but a man with his own struggles and desires. At one point, he laughed at something she said, and the sound filled the empty room like music. She realized how rare it was to share such moments in her home. With Richard, conversations were predictable, revolving around investments and social obligations. But with Daniel, there was an ease, an unspoken understanding. Hours passed without notice, and when Alisa finally glanced at the clock, she was startled. "It's late," she said softly, standing up. Daniel nodded but didn't move right away. His gaze lingered on her for a fraction too long, just enough for her to notice. Something shifted in the air, an unspoken awareness neither of them acknowledged. She turned away first, steadying her breath as she walked toward the staircase. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Alisa." Her name on his lips felt different tonight. As she climbed the stairs, she told herself it was nothing, just a moment of familiarity between two people who had never truly known each other. But deep down, a small voice whispered that something had changed. The following days passed with an unshakable awareness between them. Alisa found herself more attuned to Daniel's presence, the way he moved around the house, the subtle pauses in his voice when he spoke to her, the glances that lasted a second too long. It was nothing overt, nothing inappropriate, yet something in the air felt charged, unspoken but undeniable. She told herself it was foolish to dwell on it. Daniel was simply becoming more comfortable around her, breaking the years of distant formality. But the thought did little to quiet the quiet thrill that came whenever their paths crossed. One afternoon, as she arranged flowers in the sitting room, Daniel walked in, fresh from a run, his hair damp with sweat. "You should try running sometime," he suggested, catching his breath. "It clears the mind." She chuckled, keeping her focus on the roses. "I prefer walking. Less exhausting." "You might like the rush," he said, stepping closer. His voice was casual, but the way he watched her hands as she carefully adjusted the petals sent a ripple of awareness through her. She forced a smile, turning away. "I think I'll stick to my routines." That night, Richard called from his trip, his voice distant even through the phone. He spoke of meetings, upcoming deals, and the social events she needed to attend in his absence. He didn't ask about her day, didn't notice the slight hesitation in her voice. When the call ended, Alisa sat in silence, staring at her reflection in the mirror. She had never been unhappy in her marriage, but for the first time, she questioned whether she had ever truly been fulfilled. The next evening, rain poured outside, filling the house with a steady rhythm. Alisa curled up on the couch with a book, but her thoughts drifted as she heard Daniel in the kitchen, humming softly to himself. A moment later, he appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. "Figured you might want some," he said, handing her one. She hesitated before taking it, fingers brushing briefly against his. A harmless touch, yet it sent a warmth through her that had nothing to do with the tea. He sat across from her, stretching out comfortably. You ever wonder what life would have been like if you'd made different choices? She exhaled, staring at the cup in her hands. I think we all do. He studied her for a moment. And are you happy with yours? The question lingered in the space between them, heavier than it should have been. She met his gaze, searching for something, an answer, a distraction, a reason to dismiss the conversation as nothing more than late-night musings. But what she found instead was recognition, a quiet understanding of something neither of them should acknowledge. She placed the cup down and stood. It's late. Daniel nodded, but this time, neither of them said goodnight. Alisa tried to convince herself that nothing had changed, that the silence between them was nothing more than a moment of reflection. But denial could only last so long. Every interaction now carried weight, an unspoken awareness pressing between them. She avoided being alone in the same room with Daniel, yet somehow, their paths always crossed. A fleeting glance in the hallway, a brush of fingertips when passing a plate at dinner, a hesitation before speaking, as if choosing words more carefully than before. One evening, as she stepped into the dimly lit study to retrieve a book, she found Daniel already there, leaning against the bookshelf. He looked up at her, something unreadable in his expression. You've been avoiding me, he said, his voice calm but certain. She hesitated, gripping the book a little tighter. That's not true. He tilted his head slightly. Isn't it? Alisa exhaled, forcing a smile. We live in the same house, Daniel. We see each other all the time. And yet, he murmured, stepping closer, it feels like you're running from something. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let the moment linger. You're imagining things, she said quickly, turning toward the door. But then he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Am I? She froze, staring at the doorframe, every instinct telling her to leave. But something rooted her to the spot. Slowly, she turned back, meeting his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The space between them was thick with unsaid words, a pull neither of them wanted to acknowledge. It would be so easy to step forward, to cross the line they had been carefully towing. But the weight of reality pressed against her, the life she had built, the choices that had led her here. This can't happen, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Daniel didn't argue. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted what she was only now admitting to herself. But the understanding in his eyes made it worse, because it meant he felt it too. She turned and left without another word, retreating to the sanctuary of her bedroom. Behind closed doors, she pressed a hand against her chest, willing her heartbeat to steady. Whatever this was, whatever had been growing between them, it had to end. Sleep did not come easily. Alisa lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled mess of emotions she wished she could ignore. The weight of what had almost happened, what could still happen, pressed down on her. It had been a slow unraveling, each moment chipping away at the careful structure of her life until she stood on the edge of something she couldn't allow herself to fall into. Morning arrived with a heavy stillness. She moved through her routine with practiced ease, pouring coffee, arranging fresh flowers, going through the motions of a life that had felt normal only days ago. But normal no longer existed. When she turned, Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence stretched, filled with all the things they wouldn't say. He looked as if he wanted to speak, to bridge the gap that had formed overnight, but she shook her head before he could. This has to stop, she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. Daniel exhaled slowly, nodding. I know. She searched his face, looking for regret, for guilt, for something to make this easier. Instead, she found understanding. He wasn't going to fight it, wasn't going to make this harder than it already was. That, more than anything, made her chest tighten. You should go, she continued, forcing herself to be firm. It's better this way. He didn't argue. He simply studied her for a moment longer before giving a small nod. Take care of yourself, Alisa. She didn't watch him leave. She couldn't. Instead, she turned away, staring at the freshly cut flowers on the table, their petals vibrant and full of life, untouched by the turmoil inside her. When Richard returned later that evening, He kissed her cheek absently, already preoccupied with work matters. She responded as she always had, with a quiet smile, slipping back into the role she knew so well. Life would go on as it always had. No one would ever know how close she had come to shattering it all. She had made her choice, and though it felt like a loss, it was also a quiet kind of victory. Some desires were never meant to be fulfilled. Some stories were never meant to be written.